a few people around. I'm hoping that I'm speaking to a few people around. Obviously, apart from Rekha, who introduced me, nice of her to open it. And now I see Arnab also, with whom I was chatting at some point in time, has also opened in video. So has Subramanya. I know it's early morning and you all must not have groomed yourself to be visible at this point in time. But as life will tell you very soon, it is better to face what you have and what you are rather than try and be somebody else in order to come before a camera. So have the courage to face people who you're talking to. It will help you in life. It helped me in life. It probably will help you as well. So I will come down to the subject straight away. Making things happen in the government. And this applies not merely to the government. What I would try and tell you is that it applies to every situation in life. Now, this is the most interesting part. Some people have not opened their videos, but they opened their mics. So I can hear them, but I can't see them. Can you please reverse it, open your videos and shut down your mics? It will be much better. I won't get the interference of sound, but I'd certainly like to see your faces, bright young faces that give me a lot of energy as well. So in order to make things happen anywhere, in any situation, what you have to see is first identify the why of it not happening. Because unless you understand the cause of any action not happening, you'll never be able to find a solution. You will be able to scratch the surface, maybe do some window dressing, but I don't think in the short, medium or long term, it's going to find solution to a problem. If you're looking solution to a problem, you must first understand the problem and then the why of a problem. And before I go into the details of how it could happen in government, let me give an example of how possibly issues can be resolved. You know, when I was posted as Coal Secretary Government of India, at that point in time, I didn't know much about the coal sector. But I had read in the newspapers that a lot of scams had happened, CBI was after people around, and things were pretty bad. So I asked a friend of mine, I rang him up and asked him, how's this sector, coal sector? So instead of answering my question, he asked me a question. He asked me, have you seen Gangs of Wasseypur? Now, those that have seen Gangs of Wasseypur will understand what he was trying to say. You know, on some occasions, a question is a better answer than the answer itself. And in this particular case, it was so I understood how bad the situation was. You know, initially my impression was, as was the case with most of us, that the scams in the coal sector were a problem. Now I'm specifically taking the case study to illustrate to you how do you approach a problem. And this could be true, as I said earlier, not merely in the government sector, but in any walk of life. If you want to find a solution to a problem, you must understand the real essence of the problem. So when I took over as coal secretary, I recall I walked into that room of coal secretary. It's a huge room in the secretariat in Delhi. But I felt that I was walking into a graveyard because there was so much pressure in the ministry that the CBI was after officers, it was after files, and things were pretty bad. So I tried to assess what's going wrong. Because in the beginning, the impression that was gaining ground was it's because of scams that all this is happening. Then I tried to find out and I discovered that scams were not a problem per se. Scams were only a symptom of a problem that existed. The real problem was shortage of coal. Imagine a scenario, if there was no shortage of coal, why would people run after blocks and go out of the way to procure those blocks? This psychology came because people were not sure how much coal they will be to procure for the units in the near future. And hence there was this scramble to get coal blocks somehow anyhow. And that created all that scams. So having understood the cause of these, then I tried to understand the cause of the cause. Now I'm telling you all this is because you have to go down to the bottom of a problem before you start finding a solution. The second stage discovery of the problem was that why was the shortage of coal in this country? Country was sitting on coal worth 300 billion tons. And our requirement was only 800 million tons per annum. So we could easily go on for another century without batting an eyelid. So why was this problem? There was coal available. There was this coal demand. Demand was such that more than 25% of our requirement was being imported. There was a mad rush for coal. You know, when I joined, more than 25 thermal power plants were critical in terms of shortage of coal. Super critical, meaning that they had coal only for 1 or 2 days. They would have had to shut down. That was the crisis. Now, the irony was that India had so much coal, yet we were unable to produce coal. So the next level of, I'm going level by level. The next level of the problem was, why is there shortage of coal when there is so much coal available? For coal excavation, we try to identify what are the problems. And what we discovered was there are three primary factors apart from other factors that determine availability of coal in the country. One is the availability of land where coal has to be excavated. Then second is environment and forest clearance. And the third is evacuation of coal from these interior areas. Then we started working on how do we ensure that land becomes available? How do we ensure that forest clearances were expedited? How we ensure that there are necessary rakes available too? Now, I can go on and I can speak for 1 hour on this itself, but I'll stop here. Those of you that are interested in knowing how this crisis was resolved, you may have to read my book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, which delves into these aspects. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, unless you go to the depth of a problem, you will never be able to find a solution. And if you want to make things happen in the government or outside the government, this aspect needs to be understood very clearly. Now, the effort that we put in brought in a remarkable transformation. From acute shortage in 2014, in 2016, we were toying with the idea of exporting coal to Bangladesh. There's nothing short of a revolution. It happened. In fact, in my book, I have a chapter called The Real Coal Story, which talks about the real. People thought that auction of coal blocks or unraveling the scam was the real coal story. No, the real coal story was unprecedented increase in coal production. In the year 2014-15, the incremental coal production was 34 million tons, which was more than the cumulative increase during the previous 4 years. In 15-16, on top of this record production, we had an additional production of 44 million tons. So it was quite phenomenal. But the moment I did that, the production increased, the mafias virtually vanished, because world over, mafias thrive on shortages. You study any mafias, whether it was prohibition in the US, anywhere mafia will thrive if there is either artificial or man-made shortage or natural shortage. Shortages, mafias thrive on. Here was a case where many people told me, why don't you take on the mafias? Yes, I would. But I would rather go into the basic cause of why mafias exist. And if you address that cause, the problem gets sorted out. No, this is a very general observation through a very specific example. I'm trying to convey to you that anywhere, you want to do anything, you must first understand the ground reality. This disconnect between the actual ground reality and your own understanding, that creates much of a problem in government also. Now I'm coming to government. In government also, this disconnect between what is the ground reality and what you're doing. And that is why you would have seen the number of policies, and I'll give you some examples also, which are announced by the government. And the real problem in the country is not policies, it is their implementation. I recall when I was education secretary, after 2 years of coal, when coal had got sorted out, I used to go to PMO and tell them, how about winding up this ministry? Because there's no need to have a secretary here. Things have been sorted out. We had put systems in place which are actually surviving even now after 5 years I left the coal ministry. They're still there, and the coal block auctions are taking place on the platform that we created. So at that point in time, I'm talking about 2016, I used to visit the Prime Minister's office, and I used to recommend to them that wind up the ministry. So after a couple of visits, they got probably fed up of me. And at that point in time, they're looking for the most illiterate and uneducated civil servant to be made education secretary, school education secretary, Government of India. And they found that in Mr. Anil Swarup. I was promptly posted as secretary school education with no experience whatsoever in school education. But I must confess, those 2 years, I thoroughly enjoyed. Not 2 years exactly. I was there for about 20 months. I enjoyed them thoroughly. That was probably the only assignment in my entire career of 38 years where I felt that I should have had more time. In all other assignments, I had made myself redundant. And this was on account of the fact that I was soon to discover. I originally thought when I got posted to school education that I'm moving from dark dungeons of coal mines to the bright lights of school education. And I was soon to discover that whereas in coal, all the mining was underground and the mafias were overground, in education, it was the other way around. All the mafias were underground, eating into the essentials of Indian society. It was amazing. The number and the variety of mafias were absolutely amazing. So that was another experience that I had here. I handled those mafias. Time permitting, I'll talk about the school education mafias. which are much worse than coal mafias because they're much more complex, they're much more deeply entrenched, their backing is much more, and you don't know who's going to hit you where. I mean, again, if you read my book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, at the end of my career, I was being hit by these mafias. I also hit back, but that's not good. You know, you are preoccupied with a war, whereas in school education, why should there be a war? There had to be a war because, as I said, they were eating into sections. Now, let me come to the basic point that I wanted to bring forth with you. What I'll try and do is the next 15, 20 minutes, I'll explain what I have to tell you, and then probably I'll try and respond to some of your questions. I see only 11 participants here, but hopefully there will be others who would get excited enough to ask me questions, as happens in most of the webinars. They get sufficiently excited to ask me questions. I hope that will happen here as well. Now, let us try and understand this aspect of governance. In India, it's very easy to have ideas. In fact, everyone seems to have ideas or solution to problems. You talk about COVID, go around and talk to people and they will tell you what needs to be done. They will question the government why this is not being done. Because everyone has an idea, everyone has a solution to a problem. But in a democracy, for an idea to fructify and sustain, now listen to this very carefully, it has to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, judicially tenable, and in the wake of these farmers' legislations that have come out recently, I've added a 7th dimension, which is emotionally relatable. Now, let me explain these to you. And the idea of telling these is not to dissuade you or my colleagues from taking action. They should take action. But one important aspect that has to be kept in mind when you talk of action is that you must understand and appreciate the ground reality clearly. If you don't do that, you will be able to travel some distance, but you'll not be able to sustain it. Now, let me start explaining each of these dimensions, each of these aspects. The first dimension is political acceptability. Being in a democracy, I can't visualize that at a senior level, you can get any decision going unless the politician finds it acceptable. Now here, some of us are worried about some of the biases that we have against the politician. Even I had those biases. When I joined the civil service, I was of the view that politicians are damaging the country. They are the primary cause of all the problems. And soon I was to discover that they are as responsible as we are, as civil servants or a common man. Because they don't come from Timbuktu or England anymore. They are born and they are bred in the country. They're a part of the society, and hence they reflect the infirmities of the society. That being the case, the politicians also have good, bad, and ugly. And within a politician, like any other human being, there are good parts of that politician and bad parts of the politician. So in the beginning of my career, I used to end up fighting with most of the politicians. As some of my colleagues continue to do their entire career, they get transferred and then they start wearing these number of transfers as badges of honor, and they end up doing nothing in their life except crying foul or crying hoarse against the transfers that they have had. I mean, I have a slight different view on that. Again, there's a full chapter on this in my book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant. I won't delve upon it at this point in time. Maybe later on during the interaction, I'll explain that to you. So you must take politician as it exists. Now, the idea here is that you should be able to package your own solution or idea in a manner that it becomes acceptable to the politician. In my entire career of 38 years, I don't recall more than 5 to 7% cases where the politician actually overruled me. In more cases than not, I was able to convince him to my point of view. It depends on you. It depends on convincing capabilities. It depends on your communication skills. But since we live in a democracy, if he disagrees with me or overrules me in 5 to 7% cases, it's very fair. Ultimate call he has to take because he is responsible for the decision that he takes. I am there as an advisor. The decision has to be taken by him. And hence, this should be granted to a politician. But whatever you say or try and do, many of you would be aspiring to become civil servants. There is a lot of frustration I see in a lot of officers because they are unable to get across to the politician. I think my approach was very different. My approach was, I can't do much to the politician. He is what he is. What can I do to myself? Can I be convincing him enough? And let me give you 2 examples to you. One is totally disconnected with what I'm saying, but it explains to you that you can, if you want, if you're persuasive enough, can get through. The first incident happened when I had completed my stint as collector or district magistrate, and I was posted as special secretary to the chief minister, Mr. Kalyan Singh. I had never met him before, but for some reason, which he revealed later, he wanted me as a special secretary. I was also director of information and public relations. My job primarily was, in those days, we did not have this social media or anything. My job was to go to his residence every morning, go and brief him about the news coverage in the newsprint, in the newspapers. I had put in about a month as director of information. On this particular morning, I reached his residence, and as I walked into his drawing room where he was sitting, I saw that the chief secretary and director general of police were also there. They were standing beside him. And there was some heated discussion going on. Now, this chief minister, he was a very balanced man, very, very balanced, and never lost his cool. On this particular day, I could discern that he was a bit agitated. So I went inside and stood and observed the discussion that was going on. The discussion was around 7 meetings that had been lined up for Mr. Kalyan Singh in a by-poll that was to take place in Ottawa. And he was upset that he had not been consulted before these number of meetings were decided. What he was saying was that I am not well, I will not be able to attend these 7 meetings, so cancel the last 2 meetings. Now I was listening, I was a patient observer, I was listening to it. Now, what had happened was that the chief secretary and the DGP were vehemently agreeing with me. Yes, sir, how can you attend 7 meetings? Now, after some time, I couldn't hold myself back. So I told Mr. Kalyan Singh, sir, I was district magistrate a few days ago. And since I was a few days ago, and whenever chief minister came to a district, there was a lot of excitement, anticipation, expectations. So my suggestion is that you need not speak in a public meeting, but don't cancel it. You go there and express your regret regarding your throat and say that you won't be able to speak. Now he looked at me very angrily and said, do you think I'll be able to go? Now this conversation was in Hindi, but I'm translating it for your purpose because most of you are from Tamil Nadu. And I'll tell a very interesting incident about Tamil Nadu later on. So then he looked at me and said, how can I go? The moment he said that, the chief secretary started nudging me with his hand to asking me to keep quiet. But, I didn't keep quiet. I was a young, greenhorn. So I told the chief minister, sir, my job is to advise you. You have to take a call whether you want to go or not. The moment I said that, the further nudging, this. After that, there was a pin drop silence. For about 15 seconds, I thought I'll be thrown out of the room. But then Mr. Kalyan Singh again looked towards me now with a smile and he said, I think you are right, Anilji. The moment he said, I think you are right, the nudging stopped immediately and the chief secretary, yes, sir, I think he's right. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this was purely a political matter. I need not have. In my book, I question myself at the end of the chapter that should I have made my point? Maybe now, slightly more mature, I would not probably intervene. But at that point in time, I did it. But I packaged my idea in a manner that it became politically acceptable to me. That's the point that I'm trying to make. And as an aside, since I talked about Tamil Nadu, in the police, I got Tamil Nadu as my cadre. And we were on this is nothing to do with the talk today, but since I mentioned it, I'm bringing it here. We were on a Bharat Darshan and well in Madras, as it was called then, we met senior officers, we were sitting in a circle. And, I was learning Tamil around that time. And that was the day when I discovered little knowledge can be very dangerous. So we were addressing our senior officers. So when my turn came to the senior most officer, who was a director general of police. So instead of calling me Thiru, I call him a Thirudan. Now, it was a shocker. At that point in time, I didn't realize what I thought Thirudan would be more reverential as compared to Thiru. And somebody said, you called him a chore, you called him a thief. I was shocked. Then the next statement was, but I think you are right. He is actually a thief. I'm telling you this because sometimes when you're not fully conversant with a particular issue, it is better to keep quiet. I mean, I got away with it because I left police and joined the IS. Had I committed similar mistakes, I would have been thrown out of the police. So coming back to the points that I was making, so political acceptability of an idea becomes very, very important because no matter, like for example, take reservation, we may have a point of view. We may be right or wrong. I'm not taking sides whether it should be there or not. But do you think any political party will dispense with reservation? No matter how strong. You hold a referendum today. Probably the referendum will say that dispense with reservation policy. But will it be politically acceptable? So that we must understand. No, there are no blacks and whites in it. There are a number of areas where you can actually convince. There have been situations which I've described in my book where the politician disagreed with me. So it's not a question of agreement or disagreement. And why I make this point is that what the ultimate decision would be or what would the results be are not in your hand. Somebody else is going to take that decision. Someone else will decide. But in your hand is your own view and opinion, which you can, if you have the communication skills, if you can package them appropriately, you can convey to them. So that's what your thought. So for any idea to fructify and sustain over a period of time, it has to be politically acceptable. Now let us look at the social desirability part. You may have an idea if it's not socially desirable. What is socially desirable? In business parlance, it will be consumer. When you say socially desirable, whether whatever product or idea you create in a private domain or a service that you create, if it is not to the desire of the consumer, then it is not worth. You may have a great idea, but until the consumer wants it. Same applies in the government also. The number of schemes that are announced without taking into account the requirement of the target group, and that's why they flounder. If you read the book and if you read the chapter on Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, which came to be recognized world over as one of the finest schemes, it worked. In fact, the new government has again adopted basic features and come up with its own scheme of Ayushman Bharat, totally based on RSBY. This idea sustained because it was based on the desirability of the target group. So we had the poorest of the poor as target group. We had most of them were illiterate, most of them were migrant. So we used technology to take care of these three aspects, and hence the scheme survived over a period of time. So if any idea, scheme, or service has to survive, there has to be social desirability. Then, of course, technologically feasible. If your idea may be great, like when I became education secretary, there were advisors that used to come from all over the world, from India, best and the most expensive ones from those that came from across the Atlantic, who had a lot of ideas, wouldn't have done anything on the ground, but they have brilliant ideas. They give you the advice and then went back across the Atlantic in the cool climes there because it was very hot and very difficult to work in India. So they kept advising from there. So one of those came here and asked me, sir, why don't you, since you have shortage of teachers, why don't you set up these smart screens in every classroom and you webcast or telecast it from here? That guy did not realize that in India, we are still not connected all over the world, all over the country. There's still a connectivity problem. Now, I'm taking a very extreme example just to illustrate that sometimes we are not aware of the technological feasibility of an idea. It may become feasible 5 years down the line, but at that point in time is not. So technological feasibility becomes a constraint in implementation of idea. Perhaps the most important part is the financial viability, meaning thereby, in Hindi we say in UP, jeb mein nahi patta chal diye Kolkata. Unless you have money to back an idea, what is that idea worth? Till about 3-4 years ago, every railway minister used to announce these railway lines, so many of them. And if you look at the record, 90% of those railway lines were never begun because there was no money to back it. So if you want an idea to work, to sustain over a period of time, it has to have that financial backing. Now, this is not to say that if your idea is good, you have to have money upfront. Money can flow in later on also, because if your idea is great, then people will, a lot of startups are such where there is no money to begin with, but once an idea gets to be understood, then money backs it. But you can't be oblivious of the availability of money. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. When I was doing this Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, we had a lot of problems in the first 2 years in getting money. But once that idea established itself and came to be recognized, I recall from second year onwards, the Joint Secretary Budget used to ring me up to ask me, how much do you want for that scheme? And I used to put in a number, I used to get that money. So the idea becomes so great, like, again, it's in Urdu, some of you may not understand. The last, couplet of my book is, खुदी कुकर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. It actually, what it translates into is that you evolve as an individual to be reckoned with. That idea gets evolved to be reckoned with, and hence people veer around to that idea and adopt that idea. So the idea itself becomes great. The next is, of course, administrative doability, with meaning thereby that until you have an administrative structure to back an idea, that idea will not work on the ground. That is the primary problem with our ideas in this country. Policies. I recall that when Dr. Kasturi Rangan, who was tasked to write the new education policy, was chairman of that committee, When he came to meet me at that point in time, I was school education secretary. So when he asked me about my suggestions for the education policy, I told him, you are wasting your time. Now he was a bit surprised because we had constituted him. He said, what do you mean? I said, I have no problem with these policies that you're making, but the man on the ground needs action, not policies. There's so many policies that don't work. So along with the policy, you must have a clear-cut, drawn-out action plan, identifying what needs to be done, how it will be done, who will do it, by when it will be done. Because by doing that, you will make your policies more realistic. Otherwise, you can write anything in the policy. If it doesn't have political acceptability, if it doesn't have money, what is the big point in having that idea? And that is precisely what has happened to the education policy. People here are tearing their hair because requisite money has not been made available. Now, this will remain as a fabulous document, national education policy. Most of it will not get implemented because it does not have financial backing. The fact of the matter is that for the year 21-22, the budgetary allocation for education is actually less than the nominal amount of the previous year. I mean, it's crazy. On the one hand, the policy talks about 6% of GDP going to education. On the other hand, the actual budgetary allocation in nominal terms has come down. In real terms, it will be much more if you factor it to inflation. So one thing is talking about an issue. The other is getting the backing of the finances to do that. So it has to be administratively doable. Then, of course, judicially tenable. If an idea is not legally valid, if it violates any law, violates the constitution, violates any regulation, obviously the idea may appear good, but it won't travel any distance. So the legality of an idea becomes very, very important. The seventh dimension I added as a consequence of this farm legislation. Now, I have been very closely associated with this issue. I was chairman APIDA way back in 2000, and I looked at it very closely, and I initiated something which came in the legislation. Now, these legislations are, by and large, obviously there's no perfect legislation, by and large good for the farmers. But look at what is happening. This has happened because the perception that has been created. Since the manner in which it was rushed through in the Rajya Sabha, it gave an impression that something is not right with the act. And there was these people protesting against it. Had it been sold appropriately, had it been marketed appropriately, had a message been conveyed that this is beneficial to them, not now, but before the legislation came in, had there been appropriate debate and consultation with stakeholders. Now, this is very, very important. Whenever you take a decision, consult with your stakeholders. You may disagree. Disagreement is a part of it. I draw a parallel between what is happening now to the farm legislation and to the coal legislation, which was brought in 2014, when the situation was much worse. In fact, if you look at it, coal, most of the mining takes place in states which are ruled by opposition states. At this point in time, West Bengal, Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, these are the coal-bearing states. All of them are ruled by non-NDA government. Now, if you don't take stakeholders into confidence, if you don't take them along, the chances are that your idea will not work. In 2014, when we had to bring in this legislation, in fact, the late Mr. Arun Jaitley, he worked out a strategy of interacting with all such people who would oppose the bill in the parliament. So we had strategic meetings with Mr. Naveen Patnaik, Ms. Mamata Banerjee, because all these were against that legislation. But in one-to-one discussions, we managed to convince them. In fact, I have given an instance in my book. I went and met leader of the opposition, who was not technically leader of opposition, but he was the leader, Mr. Mallikarjun Kharge. I had worked with him when he was Minister of Labor. And we knew each other. I knew him officially. So I sought time from him. He was very welcoming. He called me at home. He gave me nice pakoras and chai. And after which I requested him, sir, I know you will not be able to support the bill. I have a small request. He said, tell me. I told him, please request your party members not to come to the well of the house. You know, when party members come to the well of the house, the working of the parliament gets impacted, and normally the parliament is adjourned. Now, that was the approach adopted by opposition parties at that point in time to prevent a legislation from passing. I don't know what happened internally. Of course, at that point in time, Mr. Kharge expressed his reservations, but on the day of voting, the party members did not come to the well of the house, and the legislation was passed. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, you have to take the stakeholders along with you, even if you disagree. In majority of the cases, the problem arises as a consequence of lack of communication between two parties. That communication has to be maintained. So I listed out these 7 factors. In my book, I have listed out only 6 of them. The 7th factor emerged very recently, so it's not a part of my book. In my book, I explain about political acceptability, social desirability, technological feasibility, financial viability, administrative doability, and judicial tenability. The emotional relatability part came later, and hence that was that. So if you want to have an idea doing, and if you want to make things happen in the government, you have to understand the limitations within which the government happens. So when you are as an outsider, you always curse the government, this is not happening, that is not happening. But if you try and understand why it is not happening, probably you'll be able to get things done. And this you can learn from those people who are able to make things government inside the government, make things happen inside the government, and those that interact with the government and make things happen then. It's not always, because the normal impression is that everyone in the government is corrupt and everyone in the government feels that everyone in the private sector is making money out of it. Both are equally wrong. There are nice people outside the government and nice people in the government. You have to actually find out. Government is not a monolith. Even the private sector is not a monolith. There are good, bad, and ugly people on either side of the fence because both are part of the society. People who are successful are those are able to identify those positive and good people, and they are able to work through them. If you go with a prejudice or a bias, whether it's a politician or a government officer, you can rest assured that your work will not be done. There are bad people in the government, but there are many good people also. You don't have to have a bias. You must, when you sell a product, you look at the consumer, but when you go and talk to an officer, you don't even research about him, what he likes, what he doesn't like. You will do what you feel like. So it's like a baker baking a cake without looking at the consumer requirement of pineapple cake or a chocolate cake. What cake does the consumer want? So similarly, you have to do a lot of analysis of the person you're interacting with. I remember when I was the Export Commissioner, Government of India, all these big exporters used to come and meet me, and they used to come up with a lovely document, 100-page document. That document, a copy was to be given to the minister, to the secretary, to me as export commissioner, to the deputy secretary, to the section officer, even perhaps to the chaprasi. So once when they came to meet me, I said, you give the same document to everybody. Do you think minister has the time to go through this 100 pages? He said, no. Then I said, why do you give him that? Why can't you think of an executive summary, not longer than a sheet of paper to be given to the minister? You can give a book along with it. But why do you give the whole thing? So we don't research sufficiently before I talk to somebody. I find the document very good. हमारी तरफ यूपी में कहते हैं हलवाई तो अपनी जलेबी को हमेशा अच्छा बनाता है. Which halwai says that his jalebi is not good? It is the consumer that will determine which jalebi is good. So what I'll do is I'll stop here. It's now 10:37. I would have carried on because these days I'm doing the easier part. I am doing the talking part. The walking part is much more difficult. You all people are on the verge of walking. You walked sufficiently in your engineering college, and you have to walk a lot in your life as yet. I have done most of my walking, so I do a lot of talking, and I get away with it. And I have discovered that talking is the easiest thing on earth. You can become a Rai Sahab. In UP, we call them Rai Sahab, meaning thereby advisors, because I don't have to do anything. I can now become an advisor and keep telling you, do this, don't do this, don't do that. So what I do is I write 3 columns every week in some newspaper or a blog, and I get away with it because that's I speak and write. I don't do much of walking, but I would certainly like to interact with all of you. I'm sure I would have excited you sufficiently for you to ask me questions. I would spend the next 20-22 minutes in interacting with you all. But may I again suggest, if you're asking me a question, I'd like to see your faces. I mean, I find it, a bit funny to talk to a laptop. I'm thankful to Rekha, Arnab, and Subramaniam to have opened the videos, and now Niklesh has been kind enough to show me his face. You're all very smart-looking people. I don't know, why do you hide behind a camera unless there is a bandwidth problem? In IIT Madras, I don't think you would be having bandwidth problem. But if you do have, see, Mr. Shaktivel is still behind a curtain. Mr. ITMA, whoever that is also behind the curtain. But it doesn't matter. If I can see your face, is nothing like it. Shaktivel has finally relented. I'm so thankful to you. You're all so smart. Why do you? And Vamika is the person who approached me for this, and she's hiding behind a very interesting looking, what do you call it, a circle with a few things. Sagar, thank you very much for opening video. So we can go ahead with question answers if you have any, or else I can continue to speak. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. So this is Vamika.
Oh, wow. How are you? You're still
I'm
behind a screen.
Yes, sir. So actually, I'm just having like I'm just coordinating the subsequent sessions. That's why. So yeah, I
You can't
had
be seen. You can't be seen. You appear to be very different if you show your face while coordinating for the sessions.
okay, sir. Sure, sir. I will switch on my video in like 5 minutes.
See, that is the persuasive skill of an officer, you know. I have managed to get Varmika to show her face. Okay.
Yes,
Yes, it's up to you to decide. You ask your questions if you have any.
yes, sir. So I have a question. Like I have seen that if we want to do good for people, and if we also, does that really require someone to be in a position with power? Because I have seen that, like in a very small scale, if I choose to be in a position, there are certain things like which pressurize me to be in that position, and things I have to do to retain that position, right? But how do we actually balance this? But my focus is to just do good for people. So how to prevent that hindrance?
First of all, Vamika, you should be clear in your mind what do you want to do, and that decision is yours, not somebody else. You can listen to everyone. You can keep listening to me asking you to open your video, but ultimate decision is yours. So long as you are happy with your decision, very fair. I should not be determining what is right or wrong for you. I can keep telling you what I want, but ultimately you have to decide whether you will ultimately open your video or not. You might find a reason not to open it. If you are satisfied with it, very good. You have to, no one else can decide for you what you got to do. The day you come to this situation where you take a decision regarding what you got to do, I think you'll be a happy person. As far as helping others is concerned, I don't think you have to have a position to help somebody. You can help people around you in any position, and you can derive enormous amount of satisfaction out of helping people. That sense of satisfaction, that gratification, that psychological state of mind is good enough a reward for you to do that. The day you come to the situation where you start enjoying the moments that you're enjoying the moments when you're helping somebody else. That's the biggest reward.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sir, thank you for such a beautiful and enriching session. Sir, I do have a doubt. So, like you said, mere framework of a policy is not enough. We should be able to implement it. So, as mere implementation of a policy is enough. So, for example, taking the social insurance scheme, RSDY or the Ayushman Bharat. So we know that it has been implemented, but we can still see a large gap between the targeted population and the actual population uh, who have been into the policy or who have been taken the insurance scheme. Like a large number of people still pay out of pocket expenditures. So should government be doing something to reduce the gap, or should are we actually doing something to reduce the gap between the actual and the targeted population?
Okay, first of all, no policy or implementation is perfect. It is always work in progress.
Yeah.
So if you look at where we were before this scheme came and where we are now, considerable distance has been traveled. A lot more needs to be done. So whereas one recognizes the fact that there's still a lot of distance to be covered, one can derive a lot of satisfaction out of the distance traveled so far. That's how you look at it, use, and that's how you travel further. Secondly, an intervention of this scale cannot come through a private incentive or initiative only. Even in a heavily capitalist economy like the US, they have this social security scheme. What is that? It is basically providing coverage to those that cannot afford insurance. I distinctly remember US insurance was having a serious problem, and Mr. Obama had taken over as the president, and we were doing this RSPY. Somehow he got to know about this scheme. So one of his advisors rang me up and he asked me, can you come out to the US and make a presentation before us regarding what you're doing there? So I tried to wriggle out, because as you rightly said, there's still, and there was at that point in time also, a lot of infirmities in the scheme. A lot of distance had to be traveled, but they insisted. So in one of my visits to Washington, where I had to go to interact with the World Bank, I visited Brookings Institute that houses all these advisors and made a presentation before advisors of the president. They were government officers, there were people from our Indian mission there. There were also representatives of Gates and Rockefeller and other foundations. Now, this is what I'm saying is an answer also to what Vamika said. You'll understand what I'm saying at the end of it. Now, when I made this presentation and I came out and I was having a cup of coffee, this guy from Gates Foundation walks up to me and asks me, Mr. Swarup, you are a civil servant, but you seem to be very passionate about the scheme that you're doing. What is the government giving you beyond your salary? Now, this is a question that could be asked of anybody. Why are you passionate about something and others are not so passionate in the same set of circumstances? So instead of answering his question, I asked him a question. I said, Gates Foundation gives millions of dollars to poor countries. What do you get out of it? He said, well, that's a job. But more than that, and Vamika listened to this carefully, but more than that, we derive a lot of satisfaction out of helping the poorest of the poor. Then I said, you answered your own question that you asked of me, because RSBY is meant for the poorest of the poor, many of whom would have been dead but for this scheme. So the good wishes of those that survived and their families come back to me somehow, anyhow. That is a good enough a kick for me to do what I'm doing. Now, I've used this word kick in my book, and there's a history to it. There's another chapter why I call it kick. And then I narrated a small incident to him. I narrated to him that once I was visiting a very small hospital that was impaneled under the scheme, and I was talking to a beneficiary patient. Suddenly, I heard a very feeble voice from behind. There was this very old lady. She could barely sit, was calling me, beta idhar aao, beta come here. So I went to her, I bent down because she couldn't get up. And I asked her, I hope you're fine. She said, no, I'm in extreme pain, but these hospital people have looked after me very well. Then I said, you'll be fine and then you'll go home. She said, no, I don't have any home. I'm a beggar. I fell ill. So my neighbor, who's also a beggar, he saw your card. This was a smart card based scheme. She says her neighbor brought her to the hospital. The hospital people are looking after her and they're not even asking for any money because she doesn't have any money to pay. So I told her, no, don't worry about the money. This scheme will take care of you and you'll go back home. She insisted, no, I'm so old. Now I'll go to the Almighty. It was very funny. She said, I'll go to the Almighty. Now I don't think I'll live very long. And then she made a very remarkable statement. She tells me, when I meet the Almighty, I'll tell him, and this conversation was in Hindi. When I meet the Almighty, I'll tell him that your scheme is great. Now, I still get goosebumps when I narrate such incidents. This is why you do what you do. Vamika, since you raised this issue of what gives you that sense of satisfaction. This is what it does for you.
Thank you, sir, for that.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Under a new education policy, the government has been.
Where are you? What's your good name? Sagar.
Yes, my name is Sagar from Vadodara, Gujarat. And
okay, Sagar, can I see your face, or your internet is not good enough for you to show your face? Yes. Okay, you are so smart and handsome. Why are you hiding behind that? No. Yes, go ahead.
Under a new education policy, the government has pushing to that courses in mother tongue, and also AICT already given go ahead for that. But institute like IITs, where various students are from various states, it is very hard to implement them. So what's your take on that? And if you want to implement these, so what is your action plans?
First of all, let me clarify that education policy is not forcing anybody. Education policy by its very nature is recommendatory in nature. That is one. Number two, the focus in the education policy is not on local languages in higher education, but the focus is on mother tongue in the initial phase of a child, that is up to class 5. And that, I think, is based on research, because all research world over proves that understanding of complex concepts in the early age is much easier in mother tongue than in other languages. And this happens world over, not only what has been recommended here. Whether it's China, Japan, in the initial 5 years, they are taught in their mother tongue. And in India also, I don't know whether you're aware, the best school in Delhi is Sardar Patel Vidyalaya. And the medium of instruction up to class 5 is Hindi. And they produce the best of students. So it is wrong to say that you have to have a foreign language in class 1 to 5, including English, to become a better child or a better educated person. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm okay with that. But even that has not been mandated under the policy. And I don't think AICT is mandating that you should be taught in Gujarati or Hindi. They may be suggesting, but then suggestion is different from mandating. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
A beautiful speech. Sir, we have got a few questions from YouTube. So Johan Kukrecha, he was asking, sir, how do we find these good officers? I mean, coming from outside with no contacts in the government, how do we reach out to the good and non-corrupt officers?
You are starting with the assumption that you are starting with an assumption that most of them are bad, and that's a wrong way to start. Start with the assumption that most of the officers are good, and then you'll find good officers. Jaki rahi bhavna jaisi, prabhu dekhi tin murat taisi. So don't start with that. That assumption is wrong. How do we find good officers? Meaning thereby that most of them are bad. And I have lived that life myself. Let me assure you, they may be quiet, they may be sitting behind a desk. Most of them are working, otherwise the country wouldn't be working. So the assumption is wrong that most of them are bad. That is one. Number two, if you talk around to people, you'll get to know who's a go-getter, a person who does it. But you have to go there with an open mind. Don't go with a bias. Good or bad. Don't even think he's good or bad. How do you find your wife? Or will you find your prospective wife? You tie up your entire life with that person. No? If you go with the assumption that most of the women or men are bad, then you'll find it very difficult to get a wife for yourself or a couch.
Thank you, sir. Sir, next question by Harith Muhammad. Bias exists in society. How to break through this bias?
Be the change you wish to see in the world. That's what the Mahatma said. Forget about what the society, forget about the world, forget about the nation for the time being, focus on yourself. If you can do that to yourself, you'll find people who do not have bias. But if you don't start with yourself, you are biased and you are looking at people who are not biased, very difficult. I found people in my life, and I continue to do that. People may have opinions, but that's not a bias. There's a difference between being biased and having an opinion. Having an opinion is very natural. In democracy, we allow differences of opinion, but that does not necessarily mean a bias. His opinion may be based on certain facts, good, bad, right, wrong. You can correct that. But bias is very difficult to correct. It's more ingrained in one's persona. So don't start with that. Start with yourself. You should not be biased to begin with. Then you'll find people who are not biased around you. But if you are biased and if you have not corrected yourself, there is a simple reason. Because you can't do a nut to others. Let me tell you, I've been an IAS officer for 37 years, police officer for 1 year. And initially I had this impression that I will change the world, I will change everyone. And gradually I realized, बुरा जो देखन मैं चला, बुरा न मिलियो कोई, जो दिल खोजा आपना, मुझसे बुरा न कोई. You have to start with it. That's what Mahatma said. Be the change you wish to see in the world. I think it's the essence of human existence. Forget about others. Focus on yourself, what you can do to yourself. And of course, there is a paucity of time. Otherwise, I could have spoken on what exactly can you do to yourself. One of my talks is based primarily around what do you do to yourself and how do you do it to yourself.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we will be taking a couple of more questions, two more. So Harith has also asked, can you please elaborate on Mafia in education sector? What is?
Oh, wow. I think I will briefly tell you. I won't be able to elaborate because that will require 1 hour. But if you want to know the details, you read my book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant. But I'll briefly tell you. Teachers lie at the pivot of school education. Teachers are, my reading of the education system was, if you improve the teachers, then the education system will improve. But look at the way government teachers are handled. First of all, the biggest mafia in school education is that of B.Ed and D.El.Ed colleges. These are colleges which train people to become teachers, Bachelor of Education and Diploma in School Education. Out of the 16,000 colleges that we have in the country, 4,000 do not exist, and they can give you a degree. What could be worse than that? And if you pay them well, they can give you a naukri as well. Now imagine the quality of teachers that you can. And they are huge mafias. They are mafias because the chairman, All India Council for Teacher Education, a senior IAS officer, who took them on, had to actually resign from the IAS because the mafias got the better of him. That was one of my biggest failures because I couldn't protect him. It's given in my book. I have treated it as my biggest failure in my entire career. I couldn't prevent him from resigning. He resigned under pressure. Now I can't go into the details because they're paucity of time. The second mafia is the publishing mafia. Believe me, what NCERT publishes just for CBSE school, about 22,000. If all CBSE schools subscribe to NCERT school books, NCERT books, and don't buy it from the private publishers, there is a differential of 3,500 crores every year. That is the price difference between what NCERT provides and what the private publisher. They were also after Chairman CBSE. You must have all heard of the newspaper of the examination paper leak that happened in 2018. In that particular case, I managed to defend the Chairman CBSE. Otherwise, she would have also been thrown out like the previous Chairman AICT. She survived. I had some contribution to play. There's a huge chapter in my book. And now she's today's Secretary, School Education, Government of India, one of the finest officers. So I've given you just 2 examples. I can give you more examples of mafias, but I'm glad that I'm through with those mafias. I couldn't win some, I couldn't lose some. I mean, like life, I won some, I lost some battles with the mafias.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I will add up a last question to this. So I am from Jharkhand, and I can see that there are a lot of schemes that government is coming with, but it's still there is a fear to face the officer. There is a fear in normal people or common people to face the academia or any administrative building. So how to overcome the fear of a common man?
This can be done, if you read my articles I've written very recently, this physical interface between common man and the government has to go. Today, technology can do that. In the 3 ministries that I worked, in all 3 ministries, I dispensed with files and papers. There was no file or paper. We reduce and cut down physical interface. Even today, I am trying to help an organization that is trying to eliminate. Now, there are tasks for which a common man has to go to a government office. So, for example, he has to go to get a copy of land record. Imagine a scenario that he doesn't have to go to any office and he gets it at a kiosk. This can be done actually. A death certificate, a birth certificate, he doesn't have to go to an office. He just uploads his applications along with documents at any private sector kiosk and he gets a copy there. This can be done, actually is being done. In Haryana, there's an organization called Samagra that has actually digitized 300 out of 500 such processes. I'm sure the number is increasing by the day. So what you say is absolutely correct. The physical interface between the common man and the government is daunting. And if that interface itself is eliminated, which can be, in fact, one of my initial chapters in my book is use of technology, whereas a district magistrate in 1991, I introduced a photocopying machine in revenue record room that cut down delays and corruption by phenomenal amount. It's there in my book. Similarly, technology can be used to eliminate corruption and eliminate delays and eliminate this fear that people have of visiting the offices. Why should they visit the office in the first place? In my understanding, this should be eliminated totally.
Sir, thank you again for such beautiful, inspirational and enriching session, I should say.
Thank you.
So due to time constraint, we cannot take up all the questions. So can we just collect it and send it to you, sir?
Certainly. What you can do is you have my email ID, send them across to me. And in case anyone of you happens to read Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, I'd certainly like to have your feedback on the book. Look forward, and it was a pleasure interacting as always with those from IITs and especially from IIT Madras. God bless all of you. Take care and do well in life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for joining us.